Okay, good morning. This is video um, on my and Doug McKnight's article, Quest for Method. It's basically, it's about um, the 19, I'm sorry, not 19, the 15th century arts master at the University of Paris named Peter Ramus. He is his name Ramus is where we get the word ramification from, um, meaning the logical end, I guess. So Ramus is famous for reforming the trivium, um, and which consists of the arts of Latin grammar, Latin rhetoric, and Latin dialectic as the first three parts of the seven liberal arts. Um, and out of this reforming that he does, not and he made a lot of enemies doing this, which we'll get into a little bit. We get both what we utilize today as teaching method. So the whole idea of a teaching method really kind of begins with Ramus. The whole idea of efficiency in teaching really begins with Ramus. And the idea of curriculum begins with Ramus and is born out of those processes. Also, for my teachers out there, particularly English teachers, secondary English teachers, as you teach essay writing to your students, but it could also be others, right? Where you find facts, create an argument, and then put it down on a piece of paper, right? You're actually utilizing Ramus's invention of method. So one could argue in many ways that all modern education began with Peter Ramus. Okay, so let me share my screen, look at my notes. So we got a couple of things up here. So I have a strange name and title up there at the top. Ralph Tyler's Principles of Curriculum and Instruction. It's a fairly famous book that nobody pays attention to anymore, but it's really the sort of beginning of our current trajectory in curriculum. And it is an extension of Ramus's work in many different ways. Because it's all about efficiency. The difference today, as in Tyler's time when he's writing this in 1949, he's writing to teachers in individual schools how to prepare curriculum. As we well know, much of that has been taken over by the state and even the federal government, or contractors thereof. Okay, contractors thereof, who do, in a sense, continue to utilize Tyler as well as Ramus. Okay, but that's just a background. Okay, see, and that book's readily available if anyone ever wants to look at it. Going back to Tyler would be an advancement based upon today. Peter Ramus, as I said, is a 15th century liberal arts master at the University of Paris. He is known at his time as the foremost authority on Latin rhetoric, okay, which is interesting. He sorry, foremost authority on Latin rhetoric. Kind of lost my train of thought. And he, as I said, he began the process of reforming the trivium, the arts of grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic or logic. Okay. Dialectic is the Latin term, rhetoric, logic is the Anglo-Saxon term. Okay. And you needed to learn Latin in order to engage in studies of the quadrivium, which are the next four liberal arts. So, and this may be repetitious for some who have 503. When you conquered the trivium, you received your bachelor's degree, probably around the age of 14 or 15. Then you were, at that point, you were legally obligated to teach the trivium at some school. Okay. The foremost school was the University of Paris, where Ramus taught. Okay. So the quadrivium was a more in-depth study of music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. What's interesting is all four of these are understood to have mathematical bases. Okay. Music was the lead-in to both arithmetic and geometry. Music was understood to be highly numerical. It's no accident that Pythagoras, for my math and geometry teachers out there, developed his geometry because he was also considered one of the foremost musicians of his day as well. So you see the mathematical and geometric relationships in music. Music was seen as a bridge between physical activity in the ancient Greek and Roman educational process. The first thing children did, boys particularly, took gymnastics. Music was next. Okay, so music helped bridge from physical activity to mental activity, meaning mathematics. And I think a lot of that points to the origins of our ideas that if you play the right kind of music, it'll help you learn. And I think there's some truth to that. Okay. Astronomy here is really a kind of basic physics. There's also aspects of the biological sciences within that process. Okay, so don't think of astronomy strictly as stargazing. It's about the motion of planets and the motion of things on Earth as well, and those relationships. What you have in the 15th century, Ramus is part of this process, is the move from the liberal arts towards the humanities. As the humanities arise in the 17th century, then we begin to see what we would recognize as kind of the modern university and modern subjects, um, where astronomy is split into individual sciences. You add in here philosophy, although one would argue that the liberal arts are all about philosophy, coming out of Plato. And, you also see the rise of history and later geography. So in Latin, it continues to be the primary language of learning all the way until really the mid 19th century. We begin to see things change, particularly in American education, probably less so in Europe. In Europe, the French probably moved to education in the vernacular in French, probably earlier than, say, the English or Germans. And part of that was because the Germans had so many varied dialects. The French were much more about having a formal French language, and we still kind of see that in the news today, as the French are rejecting changing our pronouns and things like that, that others seem to want to do. So this is the beginning of the Ramus is really part of the humanist reforms. One of his roughly followers, would be Francis Bacon. He accelerates some of this in the next generation, and as does someone we will meet in the next reading. William Ames becomes a very important, while he was a theologian, becomes a very important educationist, if you will, particularly for American universities and Harvard University and eventually Yale, which becomes important in their development until the 18th century, when through reforms we begin to see new logics. So Ramus's logic is important to us because it drives the Puritans within the university, in places like Harvard, and Temple in Ireland. I'm sorry, yeah, not Temple, Trinity in Ireland, and the Scottish universities are all begun by Puritans. And so the Puritans hold on to Ramus. It becomes very important to them. So what Ramus's reform of the art of dialectic, so the art of logic, which is what you learn in terms of how to analyze text, okay? So dialectic teaches you how to analyze a text, to create arguments, and then put those arguments together, okay? Whether it is in a composition or in an oration or in a disputation meaning a debate, oration meaning just a speech, okay? Composition means in writing, okay? In writing the essay, okay? So he refines the two parts to dialectic, and the two parts are dialectical invention, which is basically the process of finding facts, finding the facts you're going to argue, or finding arguments. Okay. And he kind of completes, because it was never fully formed in previous dialectical treatises, okay, about the art of dialectic, completes dialectical judgment. So how do I organize these arguments? Okay. And it's through his this process of completing dialectical judgment, right, which is putting your facts together, that's considered judgment, okay, into an argument, that we get method. This is how a method evolves for Ramus. Okay. Thus, to reason well, I shouldn't say thus. Probably need to rephrase that. So think of this first as a rhetorical process. So I'm creating arguments to speak, and part of rhetoric. Okay. So this is what we do when we teach. Okay. So really what he's talking about here is as much as teaching as it is anything else. And so thus, what Ramus comes up with as he develops method is that to reason well, which is what dialectic is about, okay, is to teach well. Okay. And method basically is the procedure of knitting together arguments where the end of one declaration points to the beginning of the next declaration, and so forth until you reach your conclusion. Okay. Now, he develops first what is called natural dialectic, which is a deductive process of going from the broadest of terms, the broadest of evidence, to the more particular, reaching finally examples to make your argument. Okay. And that is the natural method as well of teaching. Okay. So think of your set induction as creating a general idea for your students. And as you move through the lesson process, okay, as you model ideas, which is basically, should be a short lecture, if you will, where you may use examples, into a guided practice where you're teaching them how to engage in an activity. Then they do their practice independently, and then you finally reach your close, where they are able to, where really what you're trying to get them to do is generalize their argument. Okay. That is a deductive process. Okay. He also develops his cryptic method. Okay. So when you write and teach a lesson plan, you're engaging in Ramus's art of dialectic. That's why I say to teach is to do philosophy. Okay. To teach is to do philosophy. So you're doing philosophy when you teach. The cryptic method is an inductive process where you begin with a particular. Okay. And you find this, eventually what Ramus does is he combines these two, the deductive process moving from general to specific, and the cryptic or inductive process moving from the particular to a more general. Okay. Your set induction actually is an inductive process, but it's meant to be immediate, right? It's to create a mindset that you can then, a general mindset that you can teach from using a particular process. Not all set inductions are necessarily this way, but this is particularly if you, let's say in science, where you provide an example of something, very much coming out of Piaget, let's say, for those who know Piaget, where you're creating an idea, and then you're teaching deductively from that idea. Okay. So Ramus has 3 principles of method. Okay. He argues that, as we've just said, teaching practice is divided into invention and judgment. Okay. It is think of art as the logical arrangements of subjects. That goes back up, it kind of missed that earlier paragraph, where Ramus develops his, what I call the dialectic of arts, which is based upon what is called the law of justice, where he wants to separate knowledge into discrete categories. Here we see efficiency for the sake of teaching. In art, that is instruction, imitates nature. Okay, and this is where we see the beginning of curriculum as the orderly pedagogical presentation of any art or science, the content is. Okay, so teaching method is the logical arrangement of a subject for the purpose of teaching. Okay. Teaching must not argue about its principles, number 2. And we see that today. This has gotten us into a bit of trouble, I think, where experts have taken over what used to be something teachers did in terms of developing curriculum. Okay, but we don't argue about our principles. When you go to a professional development, there is no point in that training session where you get to argue what the right way is. Okay, you're being told what it is. You either accept it, maybe you reject it, but you never raise your voice. You don't know how many times I've been to university-based professional development, and I want to get up and just start screaming about the misdirection of what the professional development is about. The third, and we recognize this, is what is taught must be useful. We see this in for those in 503, we see this in Whitehead. Those parts of the readings that talk about Whitehead. You see this to some degree in the Aoki piece. Usefulness will be colored a bit in the next reading on technology and our technological understandings. Because in that piece, it's more than just useful. So this gives you, all this is kind of recognized, and all this was to us today, but all this was initiated really by Peter Ramus. Ramus also, his famous quote is that if we understand Aristotle's logic, then everything that Ramus argues that learning occurs from what is known to what is unknown. Okay, so what is known to what is unknown. So again, here we see the role of background knowledge as being critical in the logic of method. So you should never start with anything that's too strange. Okay. But novelty is important because it's the newness. If you're just teaching the same old thing, there is no learning that goes on. That's why there should be very limited review. Okay. And you know, when you have a pretest, you kind of know what they know. So you may have essentially a review, but it's only a review to you because you know, well, they should have gotten this last year, but they didn't. So now it's really new. Okay. Now they may quickly recognize it, or they may not. Ramos's invention of curriculum, as I call it, emerges out of his mapping, and it's included in the article, of Cicero's academic life, which becomes the model for education. And it's a model. This is not a model invented, let's say, by Ramus. It's been around. Cicero, the Latin, the Roman jurist, is often seen because he was considered the most important Latin rhetorician of his day, surpassing all others. Got him into trouble. That's why he was exiled. And so his academic career becomes the model for the liberal arts. And we see this in that map, that word map of in which Ramus talks about curriculum. And curriculum here is, I should stop. Those in 503 have already heard this. So curriculum here is a Latin term for a short racetrack for racing chariots. Okay, so that's where the term curriculum is derived. The suffix culum, C-U-L-U-M, is a prefix that denotes a shortcut, or it's a diminutive, like homunculus, which meaning small human. Okay, culus is part of that. So Ramus really is the first person to use the word curriculum. Curriculum's around, particularly in religious, in some theological arguments, meaning one's curriculum vitae, one's spiritual life. John Calvin discusses this. We think this is kind of where, whether directly or indirectly, Ramus becomes aware of the concept. But generally at this time, when referring to a course of study, the Latin term cursus, C-U-R-S-U-S, as in the course of a stream, or the course of a road, leading into the future, not a circular path, right? It's a path that leads out into life, was the way we talked about, or scholars in the Middle Ages talked about a course of study. Curriculum with Ramus in the idea of a shortcut. So why do we have to go traipsing through the fields and through the wilderness along a path when we can have a shortcut, which is what method is, right? It's an intellectual shortcut to a conclusion. Um, and so you have the idea with this eventually of a graded curriculum. In other words, following the school year cycle, it's a circular track where the end becomes the beginning. Um, and it's repeated over time, okay? It's not until the 17th century, really, that we begin to see this idea in Northern Europe, particularly of graded classrooms, of classrooms as we understand them today anyway, okay? And it's also at a time when you begin, children begin to go to school not to become scholars at universities or clerics, but you go to school just to learn stuff that will be useful in your life, particularly for a rising middle class. Okay. So schooling as we understand it, and Doug, my friend Doug writes about this in his book on the Puritans, is really about the rising middle class. Okay. And this is all part of the post-Ramus world. Part of that is also the development of psychology as an art, comes out of Ramus, or people that followed Ramus. The word map, particularly now that we have a printed text. Ramus doesn't invent the word map, it's been around. We can find it in medieval texts, particularly even in medieval religious texts like the Bible at different times. But with the printing press, I can now print a map and distribute that as something to follow, right? An argument written in a book or in a lecture. So we know that in the colonial times of the US, particularly in New England, particularly out in these small towns, not necessarily in the cities, that the local Puritan or Congregationalist preacher was also the schoolmaster. And so you would, if they had a printing press in town, he would print up a map of his sermon, to distribute it to the parishioners, so they could follow him as he spoke in church, and then use that in class with the students the next day. So the reforms, Ramus's reform of logic goes in any number of different directions. We very much teach English along the lines of what Ramus devised for the teaching of Latin in the Trivium. We also see his logic, his simplification of logic, move over some time to become a logic in mathematics that we follow. Interestingly, at the end of his life, by the way, Ramus was killed during the St. Bartholomew Day massacre in Paris. Whether he was, we're pretty sure he wasn't killed for religious reasons. The St. Bartholomew Day massacre was when Catholics went through Paris killing Huguenots, who are French French Calvinists, I should say, and is thus seen as a martyr, particularly by the Puritans. Okay, but we don't think it was because of his religious convictions. We're not really sure. He never talked about those convictions. We don't really. There is no evidence of him being either a Protestant or not. He dedicated a couple of his books to a friend of his who was a cardinal of the Catholic Church. But he did hang out with the printing industry in the Rhine Valley, because he was the first person actually to earn an income from printed books. Okay. Because his textbooks could be utilized anywhere where Latin was used to teach. Okay. But the printing industry, by and large, again, were Calvinist in the Rhine Valley, where the printing industry really developed. So there's a lot of interesting things out there about Ramus in the post-Ramus world. So anyway, well, that'll do it. As with anything, any of these discussions, videos, give me an email if you have any questions. All righty. I look forward to your classes. Bye.